Dobro. History. Archive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are focusing on one of the most paradoxical places on Earth, the Korean Demilitarized Zone.
And we're zooming in, really zooming in on a single, short, incredibly violent event that, it just perfectly exposed the fragility of the entire armistice.
We're talking about a moment that's often overshadowed by other, maybe more infamous historical traumas. But this was, in pure tactical terms, the most sustained firefight in the truce village since the Korean War ended.
It really is a phenomenal case study in escalation. I mean, when people hear about violence in the Joint Security Area, they almost always think of the 1976 axe murder incident.
Right, which was just shocking for its brutality.
Absolutely, and it's called war context. But the event of November 23rd, 1984, the Panmunjom defection firefight, was structurally different. It wasn't a sudden planned ambush with axes. It was a dynamic, moving, 40-minute infantry battle.
Fought across the military demarcation line itself.
Right across it, with automatic weapons, complex tactical maneuvers, and this is key, lethal indirect fire.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today is clear. We need to analyze the Vasily Matuzok incident. We're going to dissect the geopolitical pressures of 1984, walk through the minute-by-minute chaos, and understand the critical tactical decisions made by the UN command.
And we'll also assess the enduring but often very delayed legacy of this brief but incredibly bloody conflict.
This is a deep dive into how the actions of a single, desperate 22-year-old student fractured the peace between two superpowers and two armies.
And we have to begin with the setting itself. I mean, the Korean DMZ is a geographical anomaly.
It's just bizarre, isn't it? A 160-mile-long strip, 2.5 miles wide.
Which is, quite correctly, often described as the single most militarized border on the planet. But at the same time, because no human has been allowed to really cultivate or touch it for over 70 years, it's become this pristine nature preserve.
It's a stunning paradox. Nature thriving right under the shadow of overwhelming military tension.
And the focal point of all that tension, the place where you can actually see it, is the Joint Security Area, or JSA, at Panmunjom.
And it's tiny. It's a small circular enclave, maybe less than a square kilometer. It's the only spot where UN command forces, and that's primarily U.S. Army and Republic of Korea soldiers, stand literally face-to-face with the North Korean People's Army, the KPA.
Exactly. It's a place built for dialogues. You see the famous blue conference buildings where negotiations are supposed to happen.
But that whole environment is just humming with this controlled hostility.
It is. It's where global diplomacy meets mandatory tourism, but underneath that veneer, it is the most volatile boundary line in the world, perpetually ready for immediate conflict. The 1984 incident was the moment that controlled hostility just exploded into a full-scale kinetic fight.
The kind of fight they hadn't seen there since 1953.
Not since the armistice was signed.
And the catalyst for all of this, for those 40 minutes of automatic weapon fire, it was one man, Vasily Matuzok, a 22-year-old Soviet citizen and a diplomatic trainee.
And he used a propaganda tour, a tour organized by his North Korean host as his one and only opportunity to make a dash for freedom.
And that single decision, it just unleashed hell.
The results speak for themselves, really. Matuzok survived, he defected successfully, but the violence was immense. 3 North Korean soldiers were confirmed killed in action.
And on the UNC side,
1 South Korean soldier, a highly valued 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏 corporal named Jang Myung-ki, was killed instantly, and 1 American infantryman was wounded.
when you look at the size of the KPA pursuit force versus the casualties they took, this wasn't just a skirmish.
Oh no, it was a devastating tactical defeat for the KPA, a total rout.
And what's truly insightful here is the geopolitical ripple effect. I mean, one man's desire for asylum didn't just break the peace locally.
No, it dragged the Soviet Union, a global superpower and North Korea's main ally, into a direct, deeply humiliating security failure.
Right on the border of the U.S.-aligned world.
It's the entire Cold War reduced to a microscopic battlefield where this iron-fisted ideological control met the simple human will to escape.
So to really understand the intensity of that firefight, we have to recognize the larger stage. It's 1984. We are firmly in what historians call the Second Cold War.
Absolutely. Globally, tensions were freezing over, and fast. Détente had long evaporated after things like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79 and the imposition of martial law in Poland.
And the mood in Washington was, well, aggressive. It was driven by the Reagan administration's policy of peace through strength.
It was a time of really hard ideological lines, no ambiguity.
And that strategy translated into real military pressure, didn't it? We're talking about the deployment of the new generation of Pershing II intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Europe.
A massive escalation.
A huge escalation. And of course, the controversial announcement of the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI.
Star Wars, as it was nicknamed.
Star Wars. This wasn't just rhetoric. This was putting significant military and technological pressure directly onto the Soviet system.
And Moscow certainly felt besieged. Under Konstantin Chernenko in 1984, the Kremlin was desperately trying to stabilize its sphere of influence, and that directly impacted its relationship with Pyongyang.
So they were propping up North Korea.
Actively. Boosting military aid, supplying jets, heavy equipment, and strengthening diplomatic ties. And the reason was simple. They were terrified that North Korea would drift further toward China.
Which was already starting its own kind of market reforms under Deng Xiaoping.
Exactly. So North Korea had to be kept firmly anchored in the Soviet sphere of socialist solidarity.
Which means Matuzok's presence on that border tour was completely purposeful. This wasn't just a sightseeing trip.
Not at all. It was a carefully managed cultural exchange, a propaganda effort designed to show North Korea the solidarity of the Soviet communist world. Every single person on that tour was meant to be a compliant, ideologically loyal symbol.
So his defection wasn't just treason. It was a massive propaganda failure at the worst possible time.
And this is where the paradox becomes so critical. Because while the global temperature was freezing, the Korean peninsula itself was in this strange, localized moment of what some call fragile optimism.
Right, and that optimism, it stemmed from a natural disaster of all things, the severe flooding that hit South Korea in September of '84.
And it prompted this unexpected, almost unprecedented response from the North.
It was stunning, wasn't it?
It was. North Korea, in a highly publicized move, offered massive relief aid to the South. I mean, we're talking 50,000 tons of rice, vast quantities of fabric, cement, and shockingly, maybe against the advice of hardliners, the South accepted it.
This wasn't just symbolic. This was a huge physical transfer of goods across the border for the first time since the division.
It was monumental. And it opened the door to dialogue. After that successful aid transfer, the two Koreas scheduled the first economic talks in years, set for November 15th, 1984.
Just a week before the firefight.
Less than 10 days. The hope was genuine, even if it was tenuous, that this localized cooperation could lead to something more.
But that whole idea of fragile optimism was just shattered with extreme violence, which forces you to ask, how could military readiness stay at such a peak level when economic talks were literally happening the week before?
Because the dialogue was political theater. The military hostility was the deep, unshakable reality. That's the contradiction. The military postures, the ingrained ideology, it all superseded any temporary political or humanitarian thaw.
So let's look at the specific combat environment. The military demarcation line, the MDL, that's the actual border.
Right, and it runs directly through the center of those signature conference buildings, T1, T2, and T3.
And critically, in 1984, the physical boundary was minimal.
Minimal is the right word. The line was marked by these low concrete slabs and some gravel, just a concrete curb, really. But crucially, there were no physical fences, no barbed wire, no concrete walls separating the two sides within the JSA proper.
The only barrier was the rules of engagement.
And the political consequences of crossing. That physical openness, that non-existent barrier, was the single element Matuzok banked his entire life on. If there had been a fence, his plan would have been instantly fatal.
So now let's consider the forces. On the UNC side, you have the UNCSB JSA, the security battalion, a combined force.
It is, and we have to emphasize the ROK augmentation, the Katusas, Korean augmentation to the United States Army. These soldiers were completely integrated, trained together, handpicked for their discipline.
And for their ability to switch instantly from diplomatic posture to combat.
Instantly, they lived at Camp Kitty Hawk, which was later renamed Camp Boniface, and they maintained constant high-level readiness under extremely strict rules of engagement.
And their KPA counterparts, selected for different reasons, I'd imagine.
Totally different reasons. KPA guards were selected for ideological loyalty above all else, and often for physical attributes meant to intimidate. You know, they were often much taller than the average North Korean.
The famous stone-faced stare-downs.
Exactly, that was part of their duty. They were psychologically prepared for violence and trained to fire first, especially in a defection, which is the ultimate betrayal of the regime.
Okay, finally, let's nail down that critical piece of terrain. The Sunken Garden. Why was this seemingly innocuous landscaped area so pivotal to the high KPA casualty rate?
The Sunken Garden was in the southern UNC-controlled sector, and it was a landscape depression originally built for aesthetics for visitors. It had ponds, low brush, manicured slopes, but tactically it operated like a giant bowl.
A kill box.
A natural kill box. If you're standing outside the bowl, you have the high ground, you can shoot down into it. If you are in the bowl, your ability to move is severely restricted by the banks, and you have no line of sight to escape unless you expose yourself climbing out.
So when the KPA pursued Matuzok, they rushed into this low ground for immediate cover.
Believing they could overwhelm the UNC forces with sheer numbers and aggression, instead they trapped themselves. The minute the UNC forces arrived from higher ground and gained fire superiority, the KPA pursuers were pinned.
They traded maneuverability for temporary cover.
A fatal mistake. It made them perfectly vulnerable, especially to indirect fire. This topographical error is arguably the single biggest reason why the KPA suffered 3 confirmed dead and several more wounded.
The stage is set with maximum geopolitical tension and maximum tactical vulnerability. Now we introduce the man who was the fuse, Vasily Matuzok.
And he wasn't just any tourist. He was the Soviet elite. And that's the detail that makes this so staggering for both Moscow and Pyongyang.
He was 22, highly intellectual, and fluent in English.
Which proved to be vital. He wasn't just any university student. He was a student at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄.
And for anyone who doesn't know the Soviet system, 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄 was not just a university. It was the absolute premier training ground for the diplomatic corps, for the intelligence services, the KGB, the GRU.
The future leaders of Soviet foreign policy. He was being groomed for a top-tier role, and he was serving as an intern, a trainee diplomat, at the Soviet embassy in Pyongyang.
Which, ironically, placed him on the extreme edge of the Soviet bloc, the closest he could physically get to the Western world without arousing suspicion.
It did. And his profile suggests his motivation wasn't, a lack of food or money. It was deep, profound ideological alienation.
And this wasn't a snap decision either.
No, not at all. Sources confirm that his desire to flee the communist system had been building for about 2 years since he was in high school in Moscow. He was profoundly opposed to the rigidity, the oppression.
And his time in North Korea must have just crystallized that feeling.
It had to. Imagine going from Moscow to North Korea with its extreme austerity and suffocating personality cult. It likely just reinforced his total alienation from the whole socialist ideal.
So he finds himself in the most physically constrained, monitored nation on Earth, yet he calculates that the single most dangerous piece of real estate, the JSA, is his only ticket out. That's an incredible calculation.
It was an all-or-nothing player. He knew that the Soviet Eastern Bloc tour was highly scripted, designed specifically as anti-U.S. propaganda. It was the only way he could get within sprinting distance of the Western sector, without having to cross minefields and the deep defenses of the general DMZ perimeter.
His entire life hinged on creating a momentary distraction during a closely monitored photo op right on the MDL.
A massive gamble. The risk was astronomical. We know KPA guards were trained to shoot defectors immediately, without question. He was placing himself in the hands of fate, relying entirely on the UNC forces reacting faster than the KPA could process what was happening.
Let's move into the timeline of the action. We're calling this the 40-minute Korean War. It begins around 11:30 a.m. on November 23, 1984.
The initial setup is routine, which is likely why the KPA guards were, caught slightly off guard. The Soviet tour group arrives. The atmosphere is relaxed, at least relative to the standard tension.
Because the KPA sees them as compliant, trusted allies.
Exactly. They move toward the conference buildings, which, again, straddled the actual border.
And Matuzok uses the photo opportunity, the classic tourist moment, to position himself near that low curb marking the MDL. What happens in that critical span around 11:35 a.m.?
At approximately 11:35 and 30 seconds, Matuzok makes his move. He breaks away from the group and just sprints between the conference buildings, specifically between T2 and T3.
And that action immediately takes him across the low concrete slabs and into the UNC sector.
And that's the moment the chaos begins.
He doesn't just run silently, though. His fluency in English becomes critical here.
It is the crucial life-saving signal. As he's sprinting, he shouts in clear English, "Help me! Cover me! I'm seeking asylum."
And that single phrase, heard by the UNC guards.
It instantly differentiates him from a North Korean attacker or a spy. It signals his status as a refugee, and it dictates the UNC rules of engagement. Protect the person seeking asylum at all costs.
What was the immediate KPA response?
Immediate, predictable, and a direct, severe violation of the armistice terms. KPA guards drew their sidearms pistols and opened fire on him immediately.
But the violation that escalated this to a full military engagement was the pursuit.
It was 20 to 30 KPA soldiers, likely driven by sheer desperation and fear of their own regime's punishment, surged across the MDL in this frantic, uncoordinated mob. This was no longer a defection, this was a military invasion of the southern sector.
An attempt to forcibly retrieve a Soviet national. Astonishing. 20 to 30 armed men rushing the line. What was the UNC's initial defense?
A very small, forward-deployed patrol station near Checkpoint 4. Their job was to secure civilian workers in the area. And this patrol consisted of just 2 men, U.S. Army Private First Class Michael A. Burgoyne and 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏 Corporal 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄.
And they were armed only with their standard-issue sidearms.
Just .45 caliber pistols.
They were facing a numerically superior, ideologically charged force carrying pistols and, soon, automatic weapons. Their action had to be immediate.
It was an act of profound, disciplined heroism. Their very first action wasn't even to engage the KPA. It was to ensure the unarmed South Korean civilian laborers were moved immediately to safety.
A perfect execution of their primary duty.
Absolutely. Only once the civilians were clear did they turn to engage the onslaught.
Using only .45 caliber pistols against 20 to 30 armed advancing soldiers. How effective could that initial resistance even be?
Extremely effective because it forced the KPA to seek cover. Their return fire, though limited by caliber, introduced enough of a lethal threat to stop the KPA's momentum, to slow their frantic charge. And that hesitation bought Matuzok, who had ducked into the brush near the Sunken Garden, the critical seconds he needed.
And Burgoyne was an effective shot.
Initial reports indicate PFC Burgoyne fired accurately and managed to kill one of the lead KPA soldiers in that initial exchange, preventing an immediate overrun of their position.
But the KPA fire was also immediate and accurate.
Tragically so. Corporal 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄, providing covering fire during that initial rush, was struck just below the right eye and killed instantly. He became the first UNC casualty in the JSA since 1976.
His sacrifice was pivotal.
It was. Had he and Burgoyne not made that stand with sidearms, Matuzok would have been captured, and the KPA might have established a deeper foothold before the quick reaction force even arrived. PFC Burgoyne himself was severely wounded in the neck and jaw area, but continued to fight until he could be extracted.
That initial desperate stand by a 2-man team armed only with pistols. That's what truly defines the heroism of this opening minute.
It absolutely is, and it highlights the necessity of integrating the 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏s into the front line. Corporal Jang's immediate action was a decisive military contribution, and it was bought at the highest personal cost.
The sound of that initial gunfire, the sharp retort of the .45s and the KPA pistols, that was the alarm bell for the entire UN command defense system.
An instantaneous trigger. We know that within seconds of Matuzok crossing the line, the initial contact report came in. Second Lieutenant Thomas Thompson reported it to the Tactical Operations Center, the TOC, at Camp Kitty Hawk.
And that triggered the full alert sequence.
Immediately. The JSA's Security Force Commander, Captain Burt K. Mizusawa, issued the deployment order for the Quick Reaction Force, the QRF.
Which speaks volumes about their level of readiness. The QRF isn't just on standby. They have to be ready to move at hyperspeed.
And their readiness was validated completely by the response time. The QRF deployed immediately and arrived by truck at the scene within minutes. Some sources say as quickly as 3 minutes.
And this rapid response brought the decisive tactical advantage: superior firepower.
A massive escalation in firepower. The QRF was armed with M16 rifles and, critically, M203 grenade launchers. That's a huge step up from the pistols and light arms the initial KPA pursuers were using.
So Captain Mizusawa arrives. He now has automatic weapons and grenade launchers facing KPA soldiers who have just violated the armistice in force. This is where high-level training transitions into real battlefield command.
And Mizusawa immediately assessed the fatal tactical flaw the KPA had committed. They were massed together, pinned down, seeking cover in the Sunken Garden. He realized they had effectively trapped themselves in a kill zone.
Their need for immediate concealment overrode their military discipline.
Exactly. It restricted their ability to retreat or maneuver against his advancing UNC forces. So he didn't just order a frontal assault. He capitalized on their special disadvantage.
He used a classic envelopment maneuver.
A textbook envelopment. He directed specific squads, notably those led by Staff Sergeant Richard Lamb and Staff Sergeant Curtis Gissendanner, to move swiftly and silently through the manicured diplomatic grounds. They moved to the slightly higher ground, overlooking that Sunken Garden depression.
And what was the immediate impact of that flanking maneuver?
It cut off their line of retreat back north across the MDL. It established fire superiority from 3 sides, effectively surrounding the 𝐾𝐵 soldiers. And this maneuver immediately brought the decisive weapon into play.
The M203 grenade launcher.
The M203. It's often overlooked, but it was absolutely the decisive weapon here.
Why was this 40mm grenade launcher so devastating in this specific environment?
In a tight, confined space like the Sunken Garden, the M203 is brutally effective. It fires a 40mm grenade, often set for fragmentation or airburst. The 𝐾𝐵 soldiers were using low walls and brush for cover against direct rifle fire.
But the M203 provides indirect fire.
Exactly. The grenadier, Specialist John Orlicki, could lob the grenades over their cover and down into the depression. So the grenades are airbursting or impacting within that small, contained bowl.
The effect must have been lethal.
And utterly demoralizing. The fragmentation pattern of a 40mm round spreads shrapnel over a wide radius. It turned that confined space into a blender. It immediately established overwhelming fire superiority.
And the North Koreans had no answer for it.
None. They lacked any similar rapid-fire, high-angle weapon on their side of the line. This is where they suffered the majority of their casualties, including the 3 confirmed dead. The tactical discipline of the UNC forces, flanking, isolating, and applying overwhelming targeted firepower, it was a complete success.
Eyewitness accounts describe tracer rounds, grenades exploding, all in the immediate vicinity of the famed blue buildings where diplomats usually shake hands. It must have been profoundly surreal.
It was surreal combat happening within feet of the armistice line. And amid that intense, focused combat, SSG Lamb's squad completed their secondary mission.
Securing the defector.
Exactly. As the fire reached its peak, Matuzok was located near the helipad, terrified, but miraculously unharmed. He was quickly identified, they knew who they were fighting for, he was secured, and rushed back toward the safety of Camp Kitty Hawk.
So his desperate gamble for freedom had successfully been purchased by the immediate disciplined violence of the UNC forces.
It had. He'd made it.
The firefight rages for about 40 minutes, but eventually the 𝐾𝐵 must have realized the position was untenable. How did the de-escalation happen?
It was the North Koreans who were forced to initiate the ceasefire. They were trapped, defeated, and taking massive casualties in the Sunken Garden.
So they called for a timeout.
They did. The North Korean Joint Duty Officer, Major Park, frantically contacted the UNC JDO, Staff Sergeant Randy Brooks, requesting an immediate stop to the hostilities so they could retrieve their tracked personnel.
But the UNC forces held the ultimate tactical advantage. They could have demanded the surrender of every 𝐾𝐵 soldier trapped on the south side. Why did they agree to the ceasefire?
That was a strategic decision from the top. General William J. Livesey, the commander-in-chief of the UNC, authorized the ceasefire almost immediately.
Why?
Because the overarching goal was to prevent a localized tactical victory from exploding into a wider strategic conflict, especially one involving the Soviet Union. The priority had to be de-escalation and restoring the fragile status quo, not maximizing tactical gains on the ground.
The retrieval of the casualties must have been incredibly tense.
It was a frozen, tense scene. Following the ceasefire, unarmed 𝐾𝐵 personnel were permitted to cross the MDL back into the UNC sector to collect their dead and wounded. They retrieved 3 confirmed dead and 5 injured soldiers from around the Sunken Garden.
Watching them drag their casualties back across the line.
It was a highly visible, tacit admission of their tactical failure, a complete humiliation on their own doorstep.
Let's turn to the political fallout, starting with Pyongyang. How did they spin this catastrophic failure?
Predictably, the narrative was completely reversed for their internal and global consumption. North Korea claimed the UNC had committed a grave provocation.
They claimed the South had kidnapped a Soviet tourist.
Exactly, and that their 𝐾𝐵 guards had been unprovokedly fired upon while merely trying to protect the visitor. They maintained this denunciation at the subsequent Military Armistice Commission meetings.
But the act of requesting a ceasefire and retrieving their dead from the South completely contradicted their entire story.
It did. It exposed the lie, and for the Soviet Union, the political fallout was just deep embarrassment, humiliation.
The defection of a highly trained elite MGMO student, while under the supposedly secure watch of their North Korean allies.
It was a severe blow to their ideological credibility. So Moscow lodged a formal protest demanding Matuzok's immediate return and accusing the UNC of interfering with a diplomat.
Did that protest have any substance? What were they claiming?
Well, they leveraged their diplomatic standing, claiming the UNC had violated international law regarding the safety of diplomatic personnel. But once Matuzok was processed by neutral third parties, specifically the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, the NNSC, and his genuine desire for asylum was confirmed, the Soviet government was placed in an impossible diplomatic position.
They couldn't really escalate it.
Not without a much bigger diplomatic rupture, which they didn't want. They were already struggling with the image of being a prison state, so they had to cut their losses.
So Matuzok, having caused this international firestorm and this localized war, was quickly flown out of the region. Did he just disappear into anonymity in the West?
He did not. His later life is, understandably, heavily guarded for security reasons. But we know he was flown to Rome under the protection of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees before eventually settling in the United States.
And here's where his 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏 training paid off for the West.
It's the final, fascinating coda to the story. A declassified CIA document from 1986 confirms that Matuzok was actively contributing to Western intelligence efforts.
He was part of a red team.
Part of a red team at the Jamestown Foundation, an organization often used for intellectual exploration of adversaries. An 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏 graduate offered an unparalleled insight into the internal dynamics, training methods, and vulnerabilities of the Soviet diplomatic and intelligence corps, the very system he had just fled.
So he didn't just escape the Soviet system. He immediately used his specialized elite training to help dismantle it from the outside.
A stunning transition from diplomatic trainee to active intelligence asset.
Okay, let's move to the strategic lessons learned. This 40-minute engagement was a profound stress test. What did it ultimately reveal about the stability of the Korean armistice?
It confirmed its extreme fragility. The entire chain of events, from a 50-meter dash to mobilizing battalions and using lethal force, happened in under 2 minutes. It proved that the peace along the JSA isn't based on stability, but on highly managed, suspended conflict with zero margin for error.
The slightest individual action can trigger catastrophic escalation.
Instantly.
And the KPA's tactical failure is a major takeaway. As you said, 20 to 30 soldiers crossing the line is a massive blunder. Why did they take that risk?
It speaks volumes about the totalitarian paranoia of the North Korean regime. For those border guards, the immediate lethal failure to stop a high-value Soviet defector was likely seen as a greater, more direct threat to their lives than any UNC bullet.
Fear of their own regime was greater than fear of the enemy.
The ideological pressure was immense. The standing order, whether it was explicit or implied, was that defection must be stopped, regardless of the consequences or the armistice rules.
And that fear led to a complete breakdown of tactical discipline. They abandoned cover and rushed mob-like into the Sunken Garden.
Exactly. They made 2 critical errors: crossing the MDL in force, which was an invasion, and then failing to observe basic infantry maneuver principles by rushing into low ground without considering the elevated firing positions of the UNC. Their desperation led directly to their decimation.
Conversely, the performance of the UNC Security Battalion that integrated U.S. and ROK force was a total validation of their training.
A complete validation. Their QRF response time, the immediate differentiation between attacker and defector, and Captain Mizusawa's execution of the envelopment maneuver were flawless.
And the use of the M203 grenade launcher was the perfect tactical application of superior asymmetric firepower.
It won the fight decisively and quickly.
What's shocking, though, considering the clear-cut heroism and the tactical victory, is the controversy surrounding the official recognition for these soldiers. The awards were severely delayed.
It's an unfortunate consequence of the political climate. The intensity of the combat was undeniable. Men died. Yet senior officials at the time almost certainly wanted to downplay the event to avoid further antagonism, especially with the Soviet Union right at the height of the Cold War.
They didn't want to poke the bear.
Exactly. To admit publicly that U.S. and ROK troops won an intense 40-minute firefight involving grenade launchers would have added significant fuel to an already raging diplomatic fire.
So delaying the Silver Stars for 16 years, until around the year 2000, that was a political choice at the expense of troop recognition.
It appears so. It was a failure of the bureaucracy to acknowledge combat reality because of geopolitical caution. The Silver Star is awarded for extreme gallantry and heroism in action, and the eventual awarding of it to key personnel like Captain Mizusawa and Sergeant Lamb, 16 years later, finally validates just how extreme and necessary their actions were. It stands in sharp contrast to the initial political impulse to sweep it under the rug.
And we cannot conclude without honoring Corporal Jang Yong-ki. His sacrifice was immediate and defining.
Corporal Jang Yong-ki's death highlights the indispensable role of the 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏, the ROK soldiers who bear equal risk on the front lines alongside their American comrades. He did not hesitate. His actions alongside PFC Burgoyne provided the crucial covering fire needed in that first minute to slow the KPA charge and ensure Matuzok could survive.
He was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star with V device for his heroism, and his legacy is cemented by a monument in the JSA. It is a permanent reminder that the peace held and Matuzok gained his freedom because of the immediate lethal actions of the soldiers defending that fragile line. So to summarize our deep dive, the Panmunjom defection firefight of 1984, ignited by the ideological choice of Vasily Matuzok, was far more than a simple border incident. It was a precise, violent test of the armistice that ultimately affirmed the readiness and discipline of the UNC forces.
And it forced a critical, painful recognition that the line, despite being a diplomatic venue, was a perpetual kill zone. This led directly to the tighter security measures and the strict physical separation we see at the JSA today.
And ultimately, the entire narrative, the geopolitical maneuvering, the military control, the careful choreography of the Cold War was all overturned by the persistent, unyielding will of a single individual.
The event demonstrates the absolute limits of total state control. Even on the most secure, ideologically sealed border on the planet, one man's decision to sprint for freedom can fracture the status quo between nuclear powers.
The powerful thought, one single act of defiance changing the course of military action for 40 intense minutes.
Now for a final, darker thought for you, the listener, to mull over. We know the fate of Matuzok. He survived and contributed to Western intelligence. We know the fate of the UNC soldiers. They eventually received their long-delayed medals. But what happened to the surviving North Korean troops who were allowed to cross back into the north? Defeated, humiliated, having lost 3 comrades, and failed to stop the defector.
That's a good question.
Unverified but persistent rumors circulated among UNC troops shortly after the repatriation that gunshots were heard in the North Korean sector. It suggests that for those failed guards, the fight and the ultimate penalty for ideological failure might have continued internally within the DPRK regime long after the official ceasefire was authorized.
That's a chilling note on which to end a discussion about the limits of control. Thank you for diving deep with us today.
Always a pleasure.